Hello, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show. I am your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and I'm joined today by the venerable man of the East Rand, Mr. Marius Roodt. Marius, how are you?
Hello, Nick.
So unenthusiastic, Marius. Not enough energy. And the wise and powerful Miss Sara gone. Sara, how are you?
Beautifully described, Nick. I'm well.
Excellent. So I will admit to our listeners and watchers that today we had a bit of difficulty coming up with things to talk about. As we know, the Zondo Commission stuff is still going on, and that is all a bit dull and predictable. And I think we're going to wait until we see the end of Ramaphosa's testimony before we make any calls on that. So we decided, I think, to start off with a slightly sort of out of left field question here. Now, those of you who are keen followers of astronomy news will know that Michael Collins has passed away. Michael Collins is not as memorable a name as Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong, but of course he was an integral part of the Apollo 11 mission. He was the guy that stayed behind in the capsule while Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong descended onto the lunar surface. He passed away at the age of 90 after a battle with cancer. And his family said, Mike always faced the challenges of life with grace and humility and faced this, his final challenge, in the same way. We will miss him terribly, yet we also know how lucky Mike felt to have lived the life he did. We will honor his wish for us to celebrate and not mourn that life. He was also saluted by President Joe Biden, who said that the country had lost a great hero and that he was a tireless promoter of space and space exploration, and that even though he was sort of in the shadow, and this is evidenced by the fact that when I was told last night that Michael Collins had died, I said, who? Before I remembered, of course, who he was, which is perhaps more something about me than it is about his life. But anyway, but this does sort of raise a question. This is kind of in many ways the end of an era. Fortunately, Buzz Aldrin, the second man on the moon, is still with us. So it's not quite the end of the moon exploration era in that sense. But there's a lot of talk these days in sort of social justice circles about how tinged with colonialism and whiteness and maleness and chauvinistic toxic masculinity, the ideas around and the discourse around space exploration is. And while currently I believe NASA does have plans to go to Mars, with the increasing influence of woke ideology on many of our institutions, we have to kind of ask the question, will there be another Michael Collins in the near future? Are we going to Mars, as many people like Elon Musk hope? Sara, let me start with you. Firstly, any thoughts on the life and career of Michael Collins? And secondly, on this question of, is NASA too woke to go to Mars?
Yeah. I watched an interview with Michael Collins when they were celebrating the moon landing, the sort of, what would it be, 50th anniversary of the moon landing or more. And it was interesting. He was laconic, he was charming, very self-effacing, describing what the problems he faced, particularly the very real possibility that he would not be able to retrieve Buzz Aldrin and Armstrong from the moon to return home. And if you think about it, I mean, it was an era where the spaceships had, I think somebody once described Apollo 13 as having less computerization in it than your average Mercedes. And that is a Mercedes from a few years ago, you know. So
right.
These guys, these guys were brave. They were, and I think, one of the problems is I think the technology would probably ultimately get new astronauts up to Mars, but whether you'd call them explorers in that sort of sense, I'm not sure, because I think that sort of that exploration that requires the guts you need and the risk you're prepared to take, whether it's sort of crossing an ocean in the 15th century or flying to the moon in the 20th century, etc. It doesn't matter what era it was in or whether you were from Europe or Asia or whatever. It requires almost probably a level of reckless machismo.
Right.
It's people who get those sorts of events done. So I think while an Elon Musk it probably has a bit of that in getting his spaceships to Mars. Who peoples them might bring the whole thing crashing back down to Earth.
Yeah, just on that point, Michael Collins once described one of his fears when he was sitting in that mission orbiter, in the moon orbiter by himself. He said that the lunar module, which was necessary to take Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong back to join up with him again, only had one module ascent engine. And he said it was a singular thing. There was one combustion chamber. It was not duplicated. That engine had to work perfectly. If it would fail to start for some reason, that was the end of them. They were dead, and I was going home by myself. Those were the things that worried me. So I think that really says something about the age of that kind of exploration. There, it was almost like, I mean, when you look at that lunar module, it's like a box covered in tinfoil.
Well, I've seen the lunar module, and I mean, it literally does look like something, you know, a crazy inventor knocked up in his garage over the weekend. I mean, it's so, by current standards, it's so unsophisticated. It's absolutely astonishing. And I think, you know, the Russians in a similar position with their space exploration. So let's put it this way. Space exploration in the age of safe spaces, I'm not yet convinced about.
Yeah, you'd think that our hyper safety conscious culture will perhaps not be so keen on putting people in the ways of risks, and the kind of risks that space travel often entails. Marius, what's your take on this? Do you think that wokeness will ever have an impact on space programs? And what do you think about the life of Michael Collins?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you said. It's an end of an era, and I just quickly looked it up. Out of the 12 men that have walked on the moon, only 4 of them are still alive. So I mean, that's only 4 people still on this earth that have walked on another heavenly body. And also to your point about not many people will have heard of Mike Collins. Out of them, the 4 people still alive is Buzz Aldrin, second man on the moon, David Scott, Charles Duke, and Harrison Schmitt. And I'm pretty sure I've heard of Harrison Schmitt, and I've heard of the others, but he was the only one that would be able to tell you off the top of my head. So I think it just shows you Neil Armstrong, especially, and then Buzz Aldrin to probably a lesser degree, were captured where the guys who were known as the guys who going to the moon. I know some people don't even know that we went to the moon more than once. They think those are the only times we went. So, but I mean, with the title of this is obviously a bit facetious. Will wokeness or is NASA too woke to go to the moon? So, but we were joking before, and if we ever do or to explore space again, if we ever do decide to go to Mars, will the crew get be picked on their diversity requirements? Will we have to have certain AOCs, as in astronauts of color, or people with varying gender identities, or whatever the case is? And I think the fact is that obviously when the Apollo astronauts were picked and the guys before them, Gemini and all that kind of thing, it was obviously a very different time. I mean, I think it would have been, as far as I know, there were no women picked to train for Apollo or for Gemini. There's certainly no black Americans. And so, I mean, it was obviously, I mean, I think there was a racial element in who was picked to train to go to the moon and so on. And that's something we mustn't forget about, the great effort that and the great achievement of humanity to put people on the moon. But it's also, I think, some people would probably be right to say weren't the most diverse people in the world. But I think if we had to decide to go to Mars now and people were picked on merits, I have no doubt that there would be a diverse team of people, even going by the kind of leftist identitarian way of looking at diversity. And there'll be people of different skin colors, different backgrounds. I'm sure there'll be a mix of men and women and so on. And I think that's also something to actually be proud of, how we've moved forward in the last 50 years. And I don't think we'd even have to put, there wouldn't have to be any quotas for people going to Mars. It'll reflect humanity and the rich tapestry of humanity that we have. And so I do think there does seem that NASA is starting to look outwards again. But we have seen, I mean, some people do question whether, all the money you spend on, space exploration is worth it. And, so much money was spent on the Apollo missions and so on. And when we have lots of problems still on Earth, lots of people live in poverty, don't even have to eat and so on. But I don't think it's a zero-sum thing. I think, finding knowledge, is something valuable in itself.
Yeah, definitely. And also, I think there is a practical benefit as well, which is many fields were advanced by the space exploration program that drive towards a singular goal, and the engineering challenges that were overcome actually produced quite a lot of innovations that became useful later on to ordinary people. So it's not like, all the money sent into space ends up just coming to naught.
But that said, there is a school of thought that says that even people who support space exploration and so on, so it was actually a waste of money to send human beings to the moon, because the stuff you could do on the moon could easily have been done by robots, collecting putting out instruments to measure whatever you measure in space and to come back with lunar rocks. I mean, the Soviets managed to come back with lunar rocks, and there is a school of thought, even space advocates for space exploration, that it was actually a waste of money. And it was just the US flexing its muscles during the Cold War. There's another. Some people also think going to Mars would also be a waste of time, just for human being. Everything a human being can do there at the moment, we have rovers that can do the same. So unless we're actually looking to become a two-planet species, which some people think we should, I mean, we literally have all our eggs in one basket. I mean, if COVID was worse and was, say, a 90% killer of human beings, or a dinosaur killer asteroid came around again, that'd be the end of humanity. And maybe some people would say maybe that's a good thing.
Those people are wrong. I think that actually that sentiment you expressed, that the space program itself was a what's the word I'm looking for? Pointless expense, and that could have all done it with robots, and sending people was all just vanity and politics. I think that's a little bit of revisionist rubbish.
No, I'm not saying I agree with it. I think there's so much value to seeing a human being, like Neil Armstrong, whatever the case.
Not your view, but I'm just rejecting the idea that is. I mean, some inventions that actually came in part from needing to send human beings up on these capsules. We got thermal blankets, vacuum sealed food, advances in fireproofing. So like firefighters now use technology that was basically developed for the space program. So, there were a lot of good stuff that, we use in everyday life, or nearly everyday life. I do worry, though, that NASA, I believe, plans to go by 2025 to an asteroid with human beings, which is quite exciting, and to Mars somewhere in the 2030s. But as you say, there are all these ideas floating around that, firstly, why are we spending money on space when we should be handing out, I don't know, whatever the grants to green business would be a big one, right? Or why aren't we, why are we focusing on this colonial idea of exploration and conquest? We were talking just about the show about how there seems to be a certain narrative out there that exploration is a concept tangled up with whiteness, which I think, quite frankly, is a racist idea. Sara, what are your thoughts on that? Sorry, you're muted.
Sorry, I was trying to keep the hardy doll out of the picture, so to speak. Look, I mean, we've already given examples of the fact that exploration is not a white pursuit, solely a white pursuit. I think it's an inherent in man to discover things, to look for things. And I think there's also the awestruck factor. We want to be exposed to, even just by watching or hearing about sort of feats that are greater than ourselves. And in any event, I think a lot of the research that's being undertaken in space can only be done by humans. I mean, the technology required for it may be very sophisticated, but a lot of it is biological, and it actually has to do with things such as medicine and processes that would affect people's health. So, there's arguments for and against, but I think to abandon that sense of let's go out into the unknown and take the risk of what the unknown has to offer or not is part of where we're coming from. And I think to look at it in terms of, it's a white man's pursuit is ignoring history much beyond 1960, and it's racist.
Right. Any final thoughts, Marius, before we move on?
Yes, I agree completely with Sara. I think, basically, since we left the trees in Africa, how a million years ago, whatever the case is, humans have been exploring, and it's certainly not a white colonial thing. I mean, basically, I mean, the history of humanity is basically about exploration and going to new places, whether it was, Polynesians or, you know, people coming from West Africa down into Southern Africa, or people colonizing the Americas before, the people who became the Aztecs and the Mayans and the Incas and whatever the case is. So, yeah, it's definitely, and I think it just does a disservice to the great things that people have done by saying, space exploration is kind of this continuation of colonization. It's not something we should look at. And, yeah, I mean, I think humans are curious creatures, and I think there's always been an urge to, try discover what else is out there, and try also, I think, it's also to determine what our place is in the universe. If are we special, or are we just, a bunch of upright apes that are too clever for our own good on this, rock that's spinning around the universe?
Right. Before we move on, someone may challenge us and say, you're attacking a straw man. There's no such thing. People aren't saying this kind of stuff about space exploration. Well, just do a quick internet search and you will find articles such as this one by a woman called Caroline Haskins, which is titled "The Racist Language of Space Exploration. The language of colonialism is infecting outer space thanks to dominance by rich white businessmen and politicians." So
those are the only people who can afford to do it.
Apparently. So if you think that this isn't going to be a conversation that heats up as we go for the second wave of planned space exploration, I think watch out for it.
Nick, I just want to make one point. I think space exploration is kind of going to become one of those tribal signifiers. Like, for example, I think during COVID, if you were for lockdowns, then you were probably a person who's more on the left of the political spectrum. If you're against them, you're probably more on the right, broadly speaking. And I think we'll see people who say, we need to concentrate on the problems on Earth. We don't need to go into space. Will probably be people generally considered on the left. People saying we need to go out there, we need to see, get to Mars and the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, and even beyond that if possible. Will possibly be people more on the, broadly speaking, the right side of the spectrum.
Right. Anyway, yeah, so it is a debate, obviously, that I think is going to be important to have, and for the voices in favor of progress, exploration, and science to win against the sort of racist grievance mongers. Anyway, let us come back down to earth with a story that is much less interesting in many ways. In the sort of it's not as aspirational, a much less aspirational story, quite a dark story. And this is about the trouble going on in France. So recently we spoke about how Marine Le Pen, who is the challenger on the right to the presidency of Emmanuel Macron, she's now polling tied with him in certain contests for president of France. They have elections, I think, next year. So that's going to be a pretty hard-fought campaign. I think it's still a little bit of a long shot for Le Pen to win, but this is definitely not going to be a walk in the park for Macron. And sort of part of the background of this is rising concerns in France about the cultural tensions and the power of radical Islamists in the country. So one of the cases that sort of brought some of this idea out into the fore is that a woman called Sara Halimi had a mezuzah, a Jewish symbol, on her front door, and an Islamic neighbor of hers who is a drug dealer and I guess you could call him a cannabis addict, said that he was angered by this. He broke into her apartment and he threw her out a window. He was, I think, a Malian immigrant originally, who'd been living in France for most of his life. He shouted Allahu Akbar, or God is great in Arabic, and then said that he had killed the devil after he had threw her out the window. He was taken to court, and the lower courts ruled that he was not mentally fit to stand trial, and saying that his high consumption of cannabis had created a psychotic episode, and that this is basically what he had acted out on, and therefore he was not able to stand trial. There were I think, 3 evaluations done of his mental state. 2 of them said that he was mad, not fit to stand trial, and 1 of them said that he was fit to stand trial. So this has caused a lot of concern in France's Jewish community, which has been under attack by Islamists for quite a while. There have been several massacres and attacks. There was a massacre in a French supermarket where the killer, after killing, I think, 4 or 5 people, said that he was killing the people he hated most in the world, which he described as being the Jews and the French. French President Emmanuel Macron said in this case that he believed that the person needed a trial. Anyway, it went up to the highest court in France, and they ruled that it was not okay to send him to trial. I believe the accused is currently in a mental institution. So this is obviously, I think, a bit troubling. France doesn't have a great history with regards to anti-Semitism, and there's certainly being accusations of anti-Semitism being thrown at the French judicial system here. Sara, what's your take on this and the rising tensions in France over these issues?
I think the problem is, look, I couldn't tell I don't know how the French legal system works to the extent that I could say whether this was right or wrong. I think the problem is that the protests that are occurring by Jewish protesters in France, in America, and other places is more symbolic of a larger problem. And that problem is that, and I think particularly in France, there's a feeling that that the government may condemn seemingly anti-Semitic action, but nothing is really done about it. And part of the reason why nothing is done about it is, particularly if the attacks are committed or the murders are committed by Muslims, this appears to be, whether it's true or not, but there appears to be a reluctance to tackle the Muslim community in general because of sensitivities over the fact that it's a substantial minority. It's almost 20% of the country. And France has become, there's a reluctance to confront the issues, even in distinguishing between the Islamists and ordinary Muslim citizens. So the conversation about those issues is muted. And I'll tell you when it became sort of first of note to me is about just over 10 years ago. I was in Israel, and I hadn't been in Israel for 30 years before that. And it was in that space, suddenly you were aware of French Israelis. Now, the French are not huge sort of emigres and travelers, and this seemed very odd. And essentially, it had come from a development of the sense by French Jews that they were not safe in France, that they were not, no one was on their side. So Israel benefited. Certainly, their cuisine benefited. I can tell you that, and that was quite a distinctly worrying sign, because, as I say, one had never associated Israel with sort of the sophistication of the French, and something had obviously changed. And of course, like most European countries, the Jewish populations are small compared to any other ethnic groupings or religious groupings. So I think it's more symbolic, and the fact that both in Europe and America you have a huge increase in the last 2 years of anti-Semitic attacks and comments and stuff on social media. So I think it's much more reflective of a fear and a concern in the broad sense than necessarily whether this particular set of decisions was correct or not.
So added to this, there was also a letter that was published on the anniversary of the coup attempt against Charles de Gaulle in the 60s, where 1,000 French soldiers, including 20 retired generals, wrote a letter in a French political magazine claiming that France is headed for civil war. And in part, they raised the issue of Islamism, so it doesn't appear to be a concern that's confined to France's Jewish population. They said that France is in peril and that divisive partisans were tearing the country apart, and that something needed to be done to restore order. So, you are now seeing elements of, so it's not we don't know how representative this is of the French army as a whole. I mean, it's mostly seems to be ex-servicemen rather than currently serving ones. But it does suggest that there is this kind of rising tension, which perhaps explains why Marine Le Pen is doing so well in the polls, because she seemed to be tougher on radical Islamism than Macron is. Marius, what are your thoughts on this?
I just want to push back a little bit against what Sara said. Islam is actually quite a small, make up a fairly small minority in France. Only about 5% of French people are Muslim. And also, I'm not sure if I agree that the French government is, soft on Islamic radicalism. I don't know. We've seen Emmanuel Macron came out a little while ago saying they're going to ban homeschooling because there's a problem with Muslim kids only getting taught, the Quran instead of being taught French values, whatever the case is, whatever those may be.
Macron also had a very public spat with Turkey, which is currently under a president who has at least some allegiance to kind of Islamist political ideology.
And but who knows? I mean, a lot of that could be because of growing concerns in France about, a threat or perceived threat of Islam or whatever the case is, and also might be Macron might be getting pushed because of more support for people like Marine Le Pen and so on. But the fact is, there are people who do have there are people who feel that there are real concerns about the growing influence of Islam in France, whether these are real or not, or like valid concerns or not, whatever the case is. But I mean, as Sara points out, there's been an increase in anti-Semitic attacks in France and in other parts of Europe. It's not something we can just pretend is not a problem. But as you mentioned with these French soldiers, there's a mix of active servicemen and retired people who signed this letter. There's obviously some kind of feeling within the French military and probably other parts of French society that this is a problem and it needs to be dealt with. So it's something to be watched. I mean, Europe has generally been pretty open and tolerant of people coming from other parts of the world and, non-traditional faiths, sort of the cases, and accepting them. And so it'll be a bit of a tragedy if, French people start pushing back and, Muslim people don't feel comfortable in France. But I mean, that's been the kind of the deal of most of Western Europe, that, have liberal values, people with different ideas and different ways of living can live together. And it'll be a bit of a tragedy if we go back, especially in France, which is where we saw a lot of the ideas which saw the end of slavery and the rise of democracy around the world after the French Revolution, égalité, liberté, and fraternité, people working together for a common goal and working and living under, I know you're smiling. So they chopped a lot of people's heads off.
Yeah, I don't think the legacy of the French Revolution was particularly the reason.
No, but as the chairman Mao said, it's far too early to say what the legacy of the French Revolution is. So, but yeah, so I mean, I think there's obviously a worry, but is it a real concern? It looks like it might be. But I mean, just from our own anecdotes, I was in France a couple of years ago in Paris, and just from our 5 days there is obviously a very in-depth study I did there. Is that Paris itself seemed far less integrated than, for example, London. So, and you've heard of problems. There've been the equivalent of council estates in Paris, where immigrants, not all Muslim people, but largely from North and West Africa, live in pretty dire and impoverished conditions. And so, who knows? Is that is that something the French government can sort out or not?
So actually, that's slightly where I disagree on one of your earlier characterizations that Europe has been welcoming. I guess it's compared to what, right? Like, I think the US has actually been far better at integrating people from all around the world into its society than a lot of European countries have, which unfortunately...
The salad versus the melting pot.
Right. They have these kind of poor ghetto areas that you just talked about, where there's sort of like one ethnic group. I remember reading an article once about a similar kind of issue in the Netherlands, where this person, they moved into a sort of lower, a working class area in the Netherlands, and everyone in the neighborhood they saw was Muslim. And then there was some sort of local Dutch festival, and suddenly the street just changed, and it was all like white Dutch people. So there's clearly there's something happening in Europe where people are not, these societies seem to not be integrating, and perhaps that's why there's all these tensions.
But I mean, the US is it's obviously at root an immigrant society. except for obviously Native Americans were the case. So maybe, but then apparently Canada's also more of the salad way of welcoming immigrants rather than the melting pot. So, and they're obviously also an immigrant society. So,
anyway, we'll keep an eye on France because, of course, we saw a couple of years ago what are they called, the Gilets Jaunes, the Yellow Jacket protesters, who I think are still active in some parts of France at the moment. So France is definitely headed for, I think, quite an exciting election. But anyway, we'll see what comes of it.
Exciting in the Chinese sense.
Yeah, exciting in the Chinese
sense. Interesting in the Chinese sense, not
exciting. Interesting in the Chinese sense. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. I hope you enjoyed our slightly odd episode. We will be back with, I guess, more regular topics on Monday. Anyway, thank you very much for watching and have a good week. Cheers, everyone.